repeat the last part. The pretext for building these new jails is to alleviate overcrowding. Anyone who has ever studied jails and prisons will know that building new jails and new prisons leads only to the building of new jails and new prisons. You alleviate overcrowding, and then that facility becomes overcrowded. And you build another jail, and that facility becomes overcrowded. This is why in the United States there are now 2.4 million people behind bars, the vast majority of them Black and other people of color. Now, before I go on, I want to quote from a statement that Colombian women political prisoners released on International Women's Day a year ago. We denounce and reject a policy of penitentiaries and jails following the dictates of the United States Federal Bureau of Prisons, giving priority to considerations of security, militarization, and privatization of the establishments of incarceration. They do not consider issues of gender, and they homogenize treatment with criteria that violates human rights of the persons deprived of liberty, that imposes mechanisms of invisibilization, depersonalization, desocialization, especially in regards to political prisoners. And they go on to say, they go on to talk about the particular impact on women. And they say that they reject the construction of the penitentiaries with the advice and funds of the gringos. Now, I'm not one of those gringos. They are masses of cement, gray, constructed for men, but also to be occupied by women, for whom they ignore our specific needs as women. Gigantic containers of men and women in which they intend to rigorously make us pay for our, quote, supposed crimes, where they are looking to, quote, normalize us, which is to annul our humanity and our own free will. So I would like to thank the women political prisoners of Colombia who composed this very compelling statement. Now, I have begun with a few reflections on the connection between the prison system in the US and Colombia for a number of reasons. Number one, I want to highlight the dangers of modeling the Colombian prison system after that of the United States. And secondly, I'd like to emphasize the hegemonic role the US is playing with respect to the growth of prisons globally. And third, I'd like to point out that the development of a global prison industrial complex, along with the continuing militarism and deterritorialization of indigenous people here in Colombia and of Afro-descendant populations, is one of the main menaces of the 21st century. My theme this evening is racism and the prison industrial complex. And I see some of you in the audience who have attended the other sessions this week. And you know that a black feminist approach to an understanding of the prison industrial complex is an anti-capitalist approach. And it also entails examining the roles of gender and sexuality in the production of the prison industrial complex. The analysis I propose of this gigantic prison industry, whose tentacles reach into the media, into legislative and executive chambers of government, and most importantly into the suites of international corporations, transnational corporations. This is not an analysis arrived at by myself as an individual. These analyses have been deeply informed by work with many activists throughout the US and in other parts of the world, and scholars who focus on attempting to understand the prison industrial complex. We collectively describe ourselves as 21st century abolitionists. 21st century abolitionists. Now, 19th century abolitionism targeted slavery and did bring about the legal abolition of slavery. This is not to say that all aspects of slavery were abolished. As a matter of fact, in the US and in other parts of the hemisphere, including, I believe, right here in Colombia, we are haunted by the ghosts of slavery, by the sediments of slavery that are still very much present in our respective societies. The sediments of slavery and the powerful vestiges of colonization. But let me move on to the 20th century. 20th century abolitionists were better known as civil rights activists, attempting to further abolish the vestiges of slavery by challenging the laws of racial segregation. Activists also attempted to abolish the death penalty. However, today, the US remains the only industrial democracy to use the death penalty as a routine punishment. 21st century abolitionists see both the death penalty and the ever-expanding prison system as living legacies of slavery, as cruel legacies of slavery. Imprisonment is thoroughly racialized. Racism is the driving force behind an ever-expanding population. In the United States, the overwhelming majority of prisoners are black people and other people of color, Latinos and Native Americans and Asian Americans. And virtually everyone in prison is poor. We have only a few very rich people, and they go to special prisons that we used to call the country club prisons.
It used to happen.
Now, throughout the world, it is third world people from the global south who constitute the majority of the world's prison population. 21st century abolitionists strive toward the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment in the world. Now, I think I've already mentioned the fact that the US claims the largest prison population on the planet. But also it has the highest rate of incarceration. And this is bizarre, isn't it? The country that calls itself the model of democracy for the world has the highest rate of incarceration, in prisons more people than any other country in the world. 1 out of every 100 adults in the United States is behind bars. 1 out of every 100 adults. And on any given day, 1 out of every 37 people is under the control of the correctional establishment. That is to say, he or she is in jail or prison, is under house arrest or on probation or on parole. Now that's amazing, isn't it? 1 out of every 37 people in the US. Now in Black and Latino communities, in indigenous communities, in many Asian communities, youth are subject to a hyper-surveillance by the police. They are racialized, they are criminalized, and it is only so long before they will be actually arrested and imprisoned. As a matter of fact, if you subject anyone to constant surveillance, they will probably at one point commit an act that can be construed by authorities as a violation of some statute. And that's probably especially true here in Colombia. But the point I want to make here is that racialized surveillance has more to do with who is behind bars than do criminal acts. Many studies indicate that race is an overwhelming determinant of who goes to prison and who doesn't. And so as we explore the structure of what we call the prison industrial complex, it is important to recognize how profitable imprisonment has become. Punishment is a vast industry that generates enormous profits for multitudes of corporations. If racialized slavery was so profitable that it was the key factor in the emergence of industrial capitalism, and you might read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery for the evidence of that relationship, then we can also say that prisons in the 21st century are so profitable that they have become the basis for a complex network of institutions we call the prison industrial complex. Racism helps to generate profit. The relationship between racism and profit, however, is not a simple one. And to understand why this global prison industrial complex that is so complexly driven by racism, why it has emerged in the latter 20th century and early 21st century, we have to look at changes in the structure of capitalism during this period. It is no accident that the era that witnessed the expansion of institutions of incarceration from the 1980s on, which we call the Reagan-Bush era, the first Bush, George H.W. Bush. It is no accident that this was also the era of deindustrialization. It was the era during which manufacturing shifted from the countries of the North to the countries of the South. It was the era of the dismantling of the welfare state and the era of structural adjustment in Africa, Latin America, and other regions of the global South. And so these economic processes left vast numbers of people without access to jobs, without access to education. This was the beginning of the juggernaut of privatization throughout the world, the globalization of capital, the production and reproduction of neoliberal subjects and ideas. As healthcare became increasingly privatized, for example, ever-increasing numbers of people lost access to the means of remaining physically and mentally healthy. So what then would be the fate of people with no jobs, no social services, no recreation, no education, no health care. And we're talking about people who already suffered under conditions